TBD. So, I'm not sure if this is on your canvas or not, but
It is.
I posted the PowerPoint, but I added this one late. So I just want to kind of point out what we're going to be talking about. So mostly we'll talk about, because there are other sensory capabilities in fishes and other vertebrates, but so we're going to focus on chemosensory capabilities, and so that's going to be olfaction and gustation, basically those two things. Mechanoreception is a pretty big one for fishes, and so hearing is of course going to be a component to that, but then the other main component to mechanoreception is the lateral line system, and so that's obviously going to be more unique to fishes because they live in water as compared to terrestrial organisms. Then I'll talk about vision, which is really similar across the board in terms of vertebrate structure and function. The difference, of course, for vision would be living in water is different because wavelengths of light act differently in water than they do in air, so it's a little bit different, but the mechanics of it are essentially the same for fishes. And then two components that are related to each other. Electroreception is the ability of fishes to receive electrical signals and then use that to do something depending on what it is. And then electrogenesis is not always linked to that, but some fishes can actually generate electrical signals. And so, as far as I know, all fish that have the ability for electrogenesis also can receive those, but the other vice versa is not true. Electroreception is something that doesn't necessarily go along with or include electrogenesis. But those are the sensory systems that we'll talk about for this section of sensory systems in fishes. And then I can't remember exactly what comes after that. I think it might be ecology related stuff. Okay. Okay. For some reason, probably because I didn't plug it in. Maybe. I don't know. No. Plugged it in. There it goes. Okay. So starting with chemoreception. So the basic idea for chemoreception is that these animals are responding to chemical signals that are in the environment. So different types of molecules that stimulate different neurological pathways and allow them to get some information from their environment. Mostly we're talking about finding food, discriminating things that are food resources versus not. This is kind of what we're getting at for chemoreception. Of course, fishes are going to use chemoreception for other things like migration and courtship and things like that. But mostly what we're kind of focusing on is the ability to determine food resources. So there's two components to it, as I mentioned before. So there's olfaction, which is what we typically refer to as a sense of smell, and then the other component is gustation, which is a sense of taste. And so they're similar in that the cells are responding to chemical cues. They're different in that the neurological pathways are different. So they go to different parts of the brain essentially when they're stimulated. And so this, of course, is mostly associated with food resources, and so really specific chemical cues will stimulate this response that aren't related to other things other than eating. Okay, and then there's a third chemosensory ability that is not typical of fishes, and that's vomerofaction. And so that's mostly present in terrestrial things like amphibians, particularly well developed in reptiles like snakes. And the same idea applies, is that the function is the same. They're picking up molecules from the environment and then interpreting those. They're signaling some information to the animal, but the pathways are different. You've probably heard of Jacobson's organ. That's a vomerofaction organ in the roof of the mouth of reptiles, and so fish is not really a thing, and so we'll mostly talk about these two things. Okay, but I just included it because it is part of the chemosensory capabilities of most vertebrates. So olfaction, again, is mostly the sense of smell, right? And so again, the main difference is that these particular chemicals that in our case are waterborne, so they're floating around in the water column, and they stimulate olfactory receptors in different places depending on where they are, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. But mostly we're talking about the nasal cavity, right? So we're associating olfaction with the nasal passage, and what fishes essentially use their nares for. Most fish only have external nares, no openings to the buccal cavity. Some do, but most don't. And so the nasal openings for fishes mostly used for picking up olfactory cues, and that's where the receptor cells are. So the idea here is that once those chemical cues are stimulated, then that sends a signal to the olfactory bulb, which is a nervous component of the nervous system, and then that sends a message to the brain, and then those cues are interpreted, whether that's related to finding mates or finding a path to the stream that they were born in or whatever. That's the location where that information is interpreted. And so, of course, as I said, they're used for a lot of things. The most frequently used component with that would be to find food, but other things are also stimulated by chemical connections. Okay, chemoreception is different, but the basic idea is the same as I said before. So you've got these receptor cells exposed to the environment somehow. In this case, they're prevalent in the mouth, but in other organisms there are other places. And so, but when they're stimulated by the appropriate chemical, then that stimulates gustatory sensory epithelial receptor cells, and then that sends a message to a different location of the brain, the thalamus particularly. And so one of the differences is that as far as gustation, there's different types of receptors. And so you have a variety of receptors that respond to specific cues. As far as olfaction, the receptors might fire the same way if you have a whole different set of molecules stimulating them. So these guys are more specific, and that's going to be helpful for fishes and other organisms because we're not just finding food. Sometimes the food that we're looking for is different than it is other times, and you have to be able to discriminate that, right? Because under some conditions, animals are going to want more nutritional value per effort than they would others, and so if you can't discriminate that, then it's going to be more difficult to do that. Okay, so that's kind of what I'm getting at here. So you've got one type of receptor that really responds to one particular stimulant, and that is really important for these animals as they search for things, but they search for different things depending on the conditions. Okay, and of course this is different neurological pathways compared to olfaction. Okay, and so as I said, this is important for different things, right? One thing that happens is you want to be able to avoid things that are inappropriate, and fishes will often, especially if they're visual predators. So most fish are visual predators, and so the predatory attack response is stimulated by something moving in front of their face, and they will go after it. But the gustatory response allows them to distinguish what's appropriate and what's not, right? So there's a lot of, like, if we're thinking about freshwater ecology, for example, there's a lot of aquatic inverts like back swimmers and water boatmen and like whirligig beetles that produce material when they're attacked. They secrete secretions into the water column, or if they're in the mouth of a bass or something, they'll secrete it into the environment, and that's going to stimulate the gustatory response, and they'll just spit it out. So some of these animals are very discriminating after they get the material into their mouth, because again, most fishes are going to be visual predators, and most of the time that works, right? And so most of the aquatic bugs don't do those things, and so if you're just going to go ahead and get it, and then you can always, like a dog, you can eat it now and go ahead and throw it up later if you need to. Okay, so and then as I said before, during some times, animals, and not just fishes, but animals in general, right? So, and we think about terrestrial animals, particularly things like amphibians. If conditions are dry, then they will search for food items that have a higher moisture content. That's been established over and over again through scientific investigations. Fishes are the same way. During some times of the year, they need certain things for maybe developing eggs, or the testes are maturing, and so there's a different set of nutritional components to that, and so they can use the gustatory response to select specific types of prey items that will give them those nutritional needs that they must have. Okay, so if we're looking at just some of the structures associated with that, and going back to olfaction, The olfaction, so the sensory capabilities that involve what we would describe as olfaction, mostly are taking place in the olfactory organs, which have some components. It's fairly simple, but there are some particulars to it that are important. So the anterior opening is the anterior nostril. So most fishes have two openings on either side of the head. Sometimes they're distant like this, right? So here's the anterior opening, here's the posterior opening, and they're widely spaced. Sometimes it's just a flap of tissue between the two, right? So, let's see. So sometimes you have something like that where you have an opening here and then an opening here that's well spaced. Sometimes you'll have an opening here, a tissue or a flap of some sort, and an opening right behind it, right? So still you have an anterior, posterior, but they're close together. Sometimes they're far apart, like that one. But generally speaking, they're going to have two openings, and the idea is water's going to go in one end and come out the other end, and that's going to be the most efficient way to do that. Some fish only have one opening, and that's less efficient because the water comes in and it has to go back out the same opening, and while that's happening, the water can't go in. So you can't constantly sample the water column, but that's pretty unusual. Most animals, most fishes have two openings instead of just one. So in the anterior nostril, of course, and generally that's going to be the most effective way to do it, right? If you've got these widely spaced, one opening in the front, one opening in the back, the best way to do it is pull water in the front, right? How come? Why would you expect the opening where water's coming in to be at the front instead of the back?
Because you're swimming forward.
Yeah, because you're moving forward, right? And so the same reason why we don't have eyes in the back of our head, right? By the time, if your eyes are behind you, by the time you see it, it's too late, right? And so that's going to allow them to sense water in front of them as quickly as possible so that they can respond to whatever stimulus might come with the water that's being pulled in. So then you've got the olfactory chamber, and so that's, of course, this main component right here. And it takes different morphological forms. So sometimes it's a long tube like that. Sometimes it's more, bulbous. So the morphology of it is a little bit different. But you have a main olfactory chamber, and that's where the sensory epithelial cells are, right? So epithelial cell is just cell on the surface, right? So you can have skin epithelial, but on the internal portion of our bodies, we've got ducts and tubes and passageways. So the cells lining those would be epithelial cells. Epi is on top of, right? So epithelial cells line stuff. And so in this case, the olfactory epithelial cells are lining this olfactory chamber. And so as water comes in, some of those cells have specific receptors, and they will be stimulated by particular chemical cues that pass over it through the olfactory chamber. Then, of course, you have the posterior nostril, and that's in the back, and then there's usually some type of valve that closes that off. Of course, again, the main reason why you want that is so that you don't have water coming back this way, which makes it less efficient. If you've got water trying to come in and water coming in from the back, then you're not sampling the water as effectively as you can. And in most cases, in animals living out in the wild, that's going to be important to respond quickly to things, either it's food resource or predators, etc. And that's where the water goes out. Here's a boat. So on this guy, you've got the anterior's got like a tube shape, and so they can kind of direct their intake from that. And so it takes different forms, but most of them have some type of anterior opening and a posterior opening. And then most of them have some type of accessory sac, and so that's what this is. And the accessory sac, again, it's different. The morphology of it is different depending on the animal that you're looking at. But there is some type of accessory chamber that's not lined. What makes it accessory is that it doesn't have sensory epithelial cells on it, right? So water that gets in here does not stimulate any kind of neurological response. Only the receptor cells that are lining the olfactory chamber do that. So there's nothing happening neurologically here. But the accessory sac is gonna be important when we talk about the movement of water, right? So these are the structures associated with olfaction in fishes. And then the next part of it is a discussion about how you get water to move in, right? So if you think about, water is fairly dense, right? So if you just have a small opening and the animal's moving forward, because of the density of water, it's not gonna go into that opening, right? It's just gonna fill up, and then the density is just gonna prevent more water from coming in. So you have to have a way of moving the water through that so that you can expose the epithelial cells to chemical cues. And so there's different ways that happens, and this kind of explains what I just said. So because water is dense, there's typically a fairly still boundary layer around moving objects, and that applies to air as well, but it's easier to disrupt in air than it is in water because water is more dense than air. So there's a boundary layer is just an area of non-moving water in this case. And so that typically happens anytime you have an object, even if it's moving through the water. So there's three different ways that these animals will ventilate the olfactory chamber. And not all species do all of these things, but most of them do at least two of them. Okay, so one of the ways that water is moved along through the olfactory chamber is the movement of cilia. And so in addition to the sensory epithelial cells, you also have cells that have cilia, hair-like projections that protrude outside of the cell membrane, and as those move back and forth, that creates a current. So the cilia is just creating current so that water can flow through the olfactory chamber. So that all of them have cilia associated with the olfactory chamber. Another thing that animals will do to accentuate that is contraction and relaxation of the accessory sac, right? So this fills up with water, and then the accessory sac is full, and then will contract, and the water that's in here is pushed out, and this valve is closed, and then when the muscles relax around the accessory sac, it opens, which creates a space with low pressure, right? What happens then? Yeah, water flows in to fill that low pressure area, right? So, and if this was open, of course, then water would come back in, but the valve closes, it squeezes, pushes the water out, valve opens, and then the valve closes behind that water, and then it relaxes, and then water comes in to fill that space. So these two things are the primary mechanisms for moving water through the olfactory system so that you can sense chemical cues in the water column. And then there's another process of just agitating the chamber itself. And there's different ways that fishes do that, and oftentimes associated with the movement of the jaw, right? So just moving of the upper and lower jaw will cause disruption in the volume of that, and that enhances the movement of water. So jaw snapping, so it's usually kind of a quick movement of the jaw that will, particularly the upper jaw, that will disturb that and cause water to flow through. In catfishes, one of the things that they will do is use muscular activity to move the barbels around the upper jaw particularly, and that movement of that, again, disturbs the volume of the olfactory chamber, and that allows the water to move through there. Okay, anybody have any questions on that? Okay, so again, mostly they're just sensing chemical cues, and they can do that just by sitting still as long as they can create a current through the olfactory chamber, and that allows them to pick up a whole variety of chemical cues based on the surroundings of the water column. Okay, so just a little bit about the differences, the structural differences among them. So if we look at the teleos, which are the bony fish, and then the chondrichthyans, which are the sharks, skates, and rays, some of them. Most of them have one or two pairs of openings on either side. Like I said, most are going to have two pairs in some form, like either this or that. So that would be two pairs. Sometimes they only have one. So here's an example of a fish that has two openings, but they're closely spaced. Right? So here's the anterior opening, and water goes in, and then this is the posterior opening, and water comes out. And if you look inside, you can see some kind of ridges. And so a lot of times on the inside, it's not flat like that. You've got a series of kind of longitudinal ridges that are you know, in different orientations, but that creates what?
Surface area.
Lots of surface area. So the more water that's in contact with the sensory cells, the more likely you're going to pick up a cue, right? So if you've got just a tube like this, and then a cylinder of water passes through that, most of that water is not exposed to any of the receptor cells, because that's always on the epithelial types of cells. And if you just have a tube that's relatively smooth, almost no surface area there, so 90% of the water is not coming in contact with the epithelial receptor cells. And so all of these animals are going to have lots of ridges and bumps and conky type structures on the inside of the nasal cavity, just to add surface area so that you can have more epithelial cells sensing the chemicals. This is of course a shark, and so you can see here's the anterior one and here's the posterior one. On these guys is on the underside of the snout. So the morphology is a little bit different, but the basic function and structure is pretty similar among them. This is one that just has one opening, right? So here's an opening and that's it. And so a little bit less effective, and a little bit of variability among species, but most of them have two openings on either side of the head. Sometimes the openings will protrude. For some reason I didn't include a picture of the bowfin. So the bowfin is a great example. So the opening actually protrudes into the water column, and they can control the direction of those, right? Which allows them to do that, which would be what? Why would that be helpful? If I'm doing this, why is that helpful?
Sense prey left or right of you?
What's that?
Sense prey left or right of you?
Yeah, so you can get some sense of direction, right? If you've got them right on the tip of the snout, the water that's coming from this way is probably going to influence the sensory cells on both sets, because they're so close together. And so you still don't really know which direction the chemical cue is coming from. But if you can spread them out like that, like the fork of a snake tongue, they stick their tongue out and they're doing like that, trying to pick up chemical cues coming from this way. If it's food, they're going that way, right? So some of these animals have a external nares that protrude in the form of some type of tube that gives them the ability to pick up the direction of chemical cues that are in the water column. And for these guys, the nasal cavity is nasal cavity only, right? So water goes in one side, comes out the other, and the only place water is going to be present and moving is from the anterior to the posterior, and that's it. So there's nothing else involved with the water that goes into the nasal passages, and that's what I mean by dead end sacs. And sometimes it's literally a dead end, so you got one opening, water comes in, water comes out. Sometimes they're spaced, but the water that goes in the anterior is coming out back into the environment, and that it doesn't go anywhere else for these guys. Except for of the teleos and chondrichthyes, except for these two guys, the ratfish and the lungfish, the external nares will open into internal nares, and that goes into the branchial cavity, right? So in addition to olfaction, what can also be happening with the water that goes into the branchial cavity? What else can they get out of it if it gets into the branchial cavity? Oxygen. So water can come in, bathe the sensory epithelial cells that are part of the olfactory system, pick up chemical cues. That water continues into the branchial cavity where they can exchange oxygen or gases with the gills. And so typically that doesn't happen in most fishes. It's just used for olfaction. In some cases it can also be used for respiration. Okay, for the anathans, there's a little bit of variability. So this is of course a lamprey. For the mixini, the hagfish, you have a single opening that leads to the pharynx. And then for the Petromyxontiformes, you have a single opening that is a blind sac, right? So in some, it goes into the branchial cavity, in others it doesn't. So there's no real consistent pattern among the jawless fishes, the hagfish and the lampreys. Okay, let's see. So the next part of it is gestations, and so essentially it's a similar type of system. You've got epithelial cells, epithelial skin structures, receptor cells that protrude through the epidermal layer into the environment. Okay? And so the only difference really between that and olfaction is you've got these, in olfaction, those receptor cells are confined to the nasal cavity, and that's the only real difference in terms of what's happening. They're responding to chemical cues the same way. And then of course those receptor cells are connected to or synapse with, that's what synapses means, they're communicating with each other to nerve cells. And so they're different types of cells, but they send a chemical message to the nerve cell, and that sends an electrical signal to the thalamus of the brain, and that allows these animals to respond to chemical cues that are mostly important in finding food. And so I've kind of mentioned this before, that you've got different types of receptors that respond to specific types of food items, and so that's going to be really important as far as discriminating. And then ultimately, the receptors in the mouth cavity are going to be what we would describe as the final discriminator. Right? So these animals will go after things based on chemical or visual cues, but once they get into the mouth, that's where they determine whether it's going into the digestive system or not. And so that's what we mean by final discriminator. And other vertebrates and snakes particularly do that. They'll pick up chemical cues and then get to a prey item, and then actually once it gets into the mouth, sometimes they'll spit it out. Just because the animal is not an appropriate food source, or they're secreting some type of noxious material. Fish do the same thing. So if the chemical that they're picking up is potential food items, they might go after it and then ultimately ingest it. But if the final discrimination does not match up with appropriate food, then they'll spit it out. Okay, the other thing about gustation is that these types of cells are not confined to the mouth, and especially the buccal cavity. And so that's another difference, of course. They're, instead of confined to a specific location, they're found in different parts of the organism. And so typically, the lips and the mouth cavity is where they're primarily going to be found. And of course, that's what's, once they pick up chemical cues in terms of their olfaction, they find it and then they ingest it. That's where you want that to be focused, so that you can decide no if need be. And this is typically true for those animals that are diurnal. So they're active during the daytime, and they're mostly visual predators, which makes sense, right? So they're going after things based on visual stimuli, and then they're grabbing it with their mouths, and that's where the gustatory response is going to kick in and allow them to discriminate yes or no. And so some examples of that would be things like trout. And so if you've ever been fly fishing, basically what you're trying to do is present these guys with something that does what?
Move.
It moves, but it looks like it's visually similar to what they're after. So you're looking for caddisflies or whatever, and so you have to present that right thing, otherwise they're not going to take it. So they're almost strictly visual predators, and then they'll go after it, and if it doesn't feel right, taste right, then they'll spit it out. And so that's a good example of an animal like that, just because they typically live in clear water environments and they're responding to things moving around or coming down the stream, and they're going to go after it. But the gustatory system is also present on other structures, not just the lips and mouth cavity. For some, they're highly concentrated on the gill rakers and gill arches, and that's mostly for those animals that are planktivores. Right? And so ultimately what these animals are doing they're swimming around in the water column where you have high concentrations of plankton, and they're just opening their mouths and letting that water go in, and then those things are coming in contact with the gill rakers. And then if it's appropriate, it's directed into the digestive system. If it's not, then they're going to let it pass right out, right? So you have to be able to discriminate, but if you're not touching it with the inside of your mouth, you can't use the lining of the mouth or the tongue to do that. So you have to have another mechanism. So for these guys that are planktivorous, their gill rakers and the gill arches is high concentration of gustatory epithelial cells present on those structures, and that allows them to do the same thing basically, is discriminate food from non-food. So some good examples of that would be the paddlefish. So what they're doing is they're finding food likely with sensory cells on this paddle, which also helps. And then as they swim around, this paddle is directing, when they're swimming like that with the paddle, the water is just being forced down into this wide open mouth. And you can see the gills are spread wide, and they have really long, closely packed gill rakers on each one of those gill arches, and they're covered with gustatory cells. And so if what's coming in contact with those things is not appropriate as food, then it just passes through into the water column. If it is, then it gets directed into the digestive system. Of course, they make a lot of mistakes. You would expect some non-food things to get into the digestive system, but it makes it much more efficient, because if it gets into the digestive system but it's not a food item, then you're wasting some energy on trying to break down things that aren't very digestible. And then for other organisms like animals that live in more turbid conditions, then you've got gustatory cells on a variety of places, essentially. Most typically, you might expect them on barbels, especially if you've got the long barbels like a catfish. And so what they're doing essentially is swimming around. Most catfish, where are they going to feed mostly? On the bottom, right? So they're swimming around, and one of the reasons why they're doing that is because it's easier to locate chemical cues on the bottom with some structures that are outside the kind of the body wall. And so these animals are just swimming around close enough to the bottom, so the the barbels are dragging on the bottom, and when they come in contact with something that stimulates the gustatory response in the right way, then they're starting to look for it with their head down. Now they also have it on their lips and in their buccal cavity. So once they've figured out that there's something nearby, then they can more specifically pinpoint where that might be. So they don't feed on muck, right? So catfish feed on the bottom, but they're looking for particular things like mussels and invertebrates and even fishes and stuff like that. And so they're not feeding on the muckety muck, because that's mostly not very nutritious. And so they're using these gustatory cells on the barbels, and in fact on the skin, on the fins. And so some animals are going to have gustatory cells all over their body, and that allows them to find food where vision won't work, right? And so you can see this guy, he's got fairly reduced, and most of the bullheads are going to have kind of reduced eyesight because they live in places where turbidity is usually pretty high, and so vision is not going to be very effective in terms of finding food. So they've got these long, what we would call whiskers, or long barbels that are covered with gustatory cells, and they're going to be able to find food that way. Okay, so that's olfaction and gustation. Does anybody have any questions about that? Interrupted. Let's see, what else we got? What next? Okay, I don't remember exactly what order I put this in. I'm gonna go with mechanoreception next, if that's okay with you guys. Are you guys okay with mechanoreception? Yeah?
I guess.
That wasn't rhetorical. Rhetorical. Let's see. Okay. All right, so mechanoreception, and the reason why it's mechano is because it's a mechanical response, right? And mostly what we're talking about are structures that are moved by water, okay? And so and the system that we'll talk about works similarly in air, but it works particularly well for fishes because they are living in an environment that is dense. The medium is dense. It's also not compressible. Right? So if I push on water over here, that's going to make the water over there move. And if you've got the right sensory capabilities, you can feel that movement, and that's what mechanoreception is. The physical movement of structures that are sensitive to that. And there's different components to it. And so really what we're talking about is some way of detecting the movement of water around these animals. And that's gonna be mechanically determined, and that's the physically movement of particular structures that stimulate a particular neurological response. Okay, and of course, the ability to do that is important for a variety of reasons, to detect predators. Again, most fish, their predators are other fish, and so those animals are moving through the water, causing the water to move, and so if you can feel that, then you're better off than if you can't. It also allows, if you're on the other end of it, right, allows you to detect prey items. If you're fishing for bass, at certain times of year, you're gonna throw something on the top of the water, and it's gonna be making all kind of noise, and it's moving the water, and that's what, oh, hey, there's something, and so they can feel that water movement, and in addition to seeing it in most cases. But you want to get their attention by causing the water to move, and it doesn't take a lot because water is so dense and non-compressible, right? So if I move the water just a little bit over here, that's going to cause it way over here to move enough so these animals can find it. They're super sensitive to the movement of that, and nearly everything that happens will cause some type of movement. It's also important in orienting properly to the current, right? So if you're a trout, you want to be facing into the stream, into the current. How come?
So your food's gonna be floating.
Yeah, because if you're facing the other way, the food, oh, dang, oh, shoot, I missed it, right? So you want to be able to get it first, and so you have to be able to tell. And of course, for a trout, it might be a little bit easier because they're living in clear water, but for some animals that are living in turbid water, vision isn't going to do it. You have to have some way of figuring out which way the current's coming from so that you can take advantage of all the other things that you have to do in order to survive and reproduce. It's also really important for animals that school, right? And so if you've ever watched a video of, and I'm talking about really strict schooling species that move in synchrony, right? So they're moving back and forth, they'll as a group, as a group, as a group, as a group, and sometimes they'll spread as a group. One of the ways that they're not bumping into each other, right? They're not, oh crap, bumping it up, they're not slamming into each other, they're moving in synchrony. One of the ways they're doing that is they can feel their neighbor move, and they know exactly how they're moving, and so they can move in synchrony like that. And that's obviously going to be really important why would it be important for fishes to stay in a school, would you guess?
Look bigger.
Huh?
Look bigger, like a bigger predator.
Yeah, you're a big group instead of a little fish swimming around. That's one reason. What else might be important? Like if you're swimming in the ocean, open ocean, and you're swimming as a group, you have to swim as a group to avoid predators. Why is it important that you swim at the same speed or in the same direction at the same time?
So you don't lose anybody?
So you don't lose anybody, or mostly you're not the one that's being lost, but there's another component to it. As these animals move, they move together. Think about like this time of year, the waterfowl are starting to move around, but they don't move around by themselves, right? They move around in huge groups. How come?
Makes it easier to go through the water.
Well, yes, it makes it easier to go through the water. If you're swimming in schools, then your effort in actually moving yourself through the water is a lot lower than it is if you're moving by yourself. And so if you're constantly doing that with someone swimming the same at a constant speed, then you're much less efficient than if you're swimming like in a big group. Same with the ducks. They're migrating together, not to avoid predators. What's going to eat them out, up 300 feet in the air, swimming in big, nobody is what's going to happen. But they're flying the same way at the same speed anyway. And that's because it's much more efficient energetically to do that. And the same would apply for fishes that are moving around in the water column in large groups. Okay, so lots of opportunities that would make detecting water movement important for fishes, especially because of the environment that they live in. For animals that live in like terrestrial environments, it's not as important, right? Because it's harder to pick up. So if I'm walking around in the woods I mean, one of the things I'll use is my ears, which is mechanoreception, but I'm not gonna feel it on my body. The reason why that's true is because it's harder to move air that way, in a way that's strong enough to impact my tactile responses. And so it doesn't work very well. So for animals living in air, feeling vibrations is not really one of the ways that we negotiate the environment. We're either seeing, smelling, or hearing, and those are pretty much it, right? For fishes, this is the main way, because the environment is so different. So there's two main systems associated with mechanoreception, and that is the inner ear, and so we'll talk specifically about how that works. But that's mostly a response to what we would describe as hearing. Okay, so and you'll see as we go through this, the process of hearing is essentially the same as the process of feeling for these guys, and for us too. So our hearing happens the same way their hearing happens. It also happens the same way their feeling happens, with the same types of cells. And of course the inner ear is also involved in orientation, right? So if you have an ear infection, one of the things that is affected by that is what? Your hearing is one thing. What else? Your equilibrium, right? And so because it disrupts the process of mechanoreception. If your mechanoreception is not functioning right, you have trouble figuring out which is up and which is down because it's disrupted and you're not responding appropriately to the signals that you're getting from your inner ear. So for fishes, it's the same way. They hear things. They also can tell if they're upside down or not based on their inner ear, which is mostly easy to tell, right? But tell me a condition in which it would be harder to tell if you're upside down. There's no light, right? So turbid water, you can't tell top from the bottom. I remember one day I was scuba diving and I was running out of air, so our dive instructor said, you should go up because you're running out of air. But my buddy was not, so he stayed. And so I was going up, this was one of my first dives, and so I was super nervous about going up too fast. And so I'm going up. I feel like I should be on top. And I looked down and the bottom was coming back up. So I couldn't tell which way I was going because I couldn't see the surface. I also couldn't see the floor of the ocean. So I didn't know where I was because I didn't have the mechanoreception helping me very much. I couldn't use vision, and so it can be quite disruptive if you don't know that, right? So the inner ear is going to be important in determining your body orientation when vision is not helpful. Okay, and the other component to it is the lateral line system, which functions similarly in terms of the mechanoreception part. The mechanical part is the same. The lateral line system, though, of course, is mostly involved in feeling vibrations in the water column, which is really, it's all hearing in some way, really, if we think about it specifically. But the reception of it is in different locations, essentially. So and that's kind of what we're going to kind of focus on. So talk a little bit about the inner ear and how it works. And then we'll talk about the lateral line system, which works very similar. Hopefully you'll be able to distinguish them. But the inner ear, for most vertebrates, is very similar. The inner ear consists of some semicircular canals, and they're oriented in different directions. I'll show you some pictures of that in just a minute. But one of the main components of that is that those tubes are filled with endo, which is inside, lymph, which is fluid, basically. Okay, so the inside of our inner ear is filled with fluid, and that fluid is called endolymph. Okay, and so this is the photograph of it, and so and there's some other components to it, but these are the semicircular canals. And so different animals have different numbers of them. Most vertebrates have 3 of them, and they're oriented in different planes. All right, so you've got some that are oriented like that, some that are oriented like that, and some that are oriented like that. And the idea of those 3 planes would be what? Anybody Wanna hazard a guess?
Axis,
What's that?
like an axis, like up and down, left and right.
Yeah, so that, because what's inside of those is endolymph, and depending on what you do is how the endolymph is gonna move. If you've got the ability for the endolymph to go this way, then now you can tell if you're doing that, right? If you don't have a mechanism for measuring that movement, then you don't know if you're on your side or not. If you have it going like this, then you have a way of measuring whether you're doing this or not. And then if you have one like that, you've got a way of measuring whether you're doing this or not, right? So, and if you combine all those things, then you know exactly what's happening in all three of those planes, right? So, and they're called different things. This is pitch, you know, you're going up and down, you're pitching, and this is, if you're in a boat, what happens if you do this? What just happened to you if you're in a boat and you did that?
You flip.
Not flip.
Roll.
You rolled, right? So if you do this, you rolled. If you're doing this, whoa, whoa, whoa. What's that called when the boat does that? Anybody know? Not drift. That's called yaw, when you're doing that, when the boat's doing this. That's called yaw. This is pitch, roll, yaw. And those things are oriented in those three directions so that you can determine whether you're pitching, yawing, or rolling. And again, as you do any of those things intermediately, because they're all working together, then you can tell exactly what you're doing. Because sometimes you're rolling and yawing at the same time. And so all this combined gives you a really good idea of what's happening in terms of your orientation. But different fishes have different numbers. And so Mixini, for example, they only have one semicircular canal, which would kind of make sense if you think about it. You know, if you think, so Mixini, who is that? Who am I talking about? Hagfish. And so if you think about the morphology of a hagfish, why might you expect them not to be particularly great at determining if they're rolling, yawing, or pitching? What is it about them that might suggest that that's not really a big deal?
Well, they can like tie themselves in a knot, basically.
They can tie themselves in a knot, but think about, compared to other fish, what are they missing? Well, they have a dorsal and a ventral fin. What do they not have? Huh?
Pectoral fins?
Paired fins. They don't have pectoral fins, they don't have pelvic fins, which are used to do what? For steering, right? So for maintaining a position. So they don't have that, right? So in their evolutionary history, it's not important for them to determine that. And so if you think about what they do, they're just kind of on the bottom. It doesn't matter if they're upside down or not, because they're going to find some kind of rotten thing and they're going to go in there and eat it, right? So they're not going after something. So they're not good at steering. They're not good at maneuvering. So you wouldn't really expect them for it to be important for them to know whether they're upside down or not. It doesn't matter. If they can find the food, then they're good. Okay, we'll stop. And then we'll continue on.